Can you hear me?
Yeah,
You're a little faint.
you're a little late. I mean, slow.
No, that was Bernie. We hear you, Bernie.
You didn't hear me because I didn't say anything.
Oh, I thought you said it. The rabbi had a Bernie voice. Okay.
I don't see Bernie.
Bernie just left. There he is.
With his turtleneck on. It's cold there, huh?
It's cold here.
Bernie, are you still a Cardinal fan?
Well, they're tanking.
That's for sure.
Yeah, they peaked too early.
Pam, I noticed that you took a 7-mile hike. to the
Yes,
White tanks.
yes.
Oh,
Did you encounter any animals or?
A deer, lots of deer.
Oh,
Did you
really?
mean to go that far and just didn't turn around and go back, or was this intentional?
7 miles is nothing for my hiking club.
Okay, then. I got my prayer sheet.
Can you hear me okay, or should I
Yes.
try a different
Yes, we're
system?
We're
good.
good.
You're fine.
We're good, Rabbi.
You want me to try something else?
No,
we're
no,
good.
I hear you.
Somebody's talking.
you're a doggy.
And
Rabbi, you ready to begin?
If you can hear me okay,
We hear
Yes,
you.
we hear you.
okay. then you don't
Okay,
need me
again,
to-
just a quick reminder to be respectful of others. And if you are wanting to speak, unmute yourself, but otherwise, please mute yourselves so we don't have any static. Let us begin with the blessing. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah Adonai,
Eloheinu melech
melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
asher
chanu b'mitzvotav, tzivanu lazot divrei Torah.
divrei Torah.
Blessed are you, our Lord God,
our God,
ruler of the
ruler of the
world,
world,
who has sanctified us with your commandments, commanded us to engage in the words of Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Rabbi, let's start with Exodus.
Okay, so we are moving books today. Can everyone hear and see me okay?
yes.
Yep.
Okay, because I was trying to do a workaround, but then you told me it's okay. So if not, I will try something else. So we have quite a job. If you were there Friday night, I talked to one of my sermons about this. The book of Genesis ends with Jacob dies, Joseph dies, the children of Israel are in Egypt, and now we're going to start Exodus, where there's a whole different situation. We're not sure how much time has passed, but the situation is completely different, and a new Pharaoh arose who knew not.
Joseph,
Thank you. And so the question, of course, is, well, what does this mean? And there's two main theories, and you know the rest. So today we are on page
12.
page 12, Parak Bet, when is civil disobedience justified? And so we're now in a very different situation than the end of the book of Genesis. We're slaves in Egypt. The Pharaoh is apparently a different Pharaoh. And as I suggested Friday night, probably overthrew the previous Pharaoh or not connected to the previous Pharaoh. So he not only doesn't feel any obligation to people that were helping the previous Pharaoh, but maybe he deliberately, wants to attack them. And so we're in a very bad situation. And so the question, the broader question is, what is civil disobedience, and is under what circumstances is that acceptable? So, for example, in today, if I don't like the U.S. government's vaccine policy on COVID. Do I and my friends have a right to, lie down on Grand Avenue and stop all traffic? Do we have, a right to stop voting? I mean, is that a good policy, just to say we're not voting until something happens or doesn't happen? Should we stop eating and go on a hunger strike? What are the limits of civil disobedience, and what would be the circumstances in which that should be engaged? Clearly, there are cases in history, in modern history, where moderate civil disobedience at the right time, usually early, could have had a tremendous effect. Generally, when you have a bad group of people forming, the best time to do something is early. Strong and early action can frequently stop groups. Once they get rolling and they become very large and very powerful, it becomes, basically the only way to, you can confront them, but you can't stop them from becoming a force. And so then if you're going to stop them, there's going to be a big conflict or a war or whatever you want to call it. But if you can stop them early, then you can prevent the whole thing from happening, at least in some cases. Any comments, opening comments? We're a small group today, so, please feel free to chime in. Minya, Dee, or Marcia?
Mouth Marcia, okay. Well, I mean, we had just had last January 6th, could you consider that civil disobedience at that point?
That's the question. I mean, one person's civil disobedience is another person's political rebellion. She heard the word civil disobedience, she comes running. Yeah, I mean, what is that? I think that most of us would view that as more of a rebellion, but I guess, it's a question of perspective. If you're on this side, it's civil disobedience. If you're on the other side, it's, aggressive rebellion. So, what constitutes appropriate and moral civil disobedience? Yes, Pam. And Pam and then Minya.
I think there's a differentiation between peaceful disobedience and civil disobedience, like a riot. For example, the example in the Torah is when the Pharaoh wanted to kill the babies, the women, the women in the Jewish women went to defend, protect the babies. So, there's a difference between civil disobedience and peaceful civil disobedience.
Explain a little more.
You've just muted, Pam.
Thank you. Civil disobedience, in my sense, means that you realize there's a law that you're going against, but in a peaceful way, you're going to go, do the right thing and go around that law for a greater purpose. And then there's civil disobedience that's a riot. There's a difference.
What, say the last part?
There's a civil disobedience that's a riot, which to me is different.
So there's a law you don't agree with, and the importance in civil disobedience is that you engage in nonviolent response.
Yes.
And what happened in the Capitol was violent because but they didn't break into the building, right? They walked in, it was open, right?
No,
That's
Oh.
that's a whole separate discussion.
right.
Ah,
It
okay,
was barricaded, yeah.
so they broke in the building, so that becomes violent.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. But let's say there was some evil dictator about to take over
There was.
Well stated, well stated.
I'm trying to be very careful here.
I know you're trying to be very diplomatic.
Yes.
But let's say there was an evil dictator. Pam's description of moral civil disobedience would not allow any violence. What if you can't stop the evil dictator without violence? Isn't there surely there's cases where violence is appropriate to stop evil? I mean, Judaism is not a pacifistic religion.
Yeah, but at last resort, I think at last resort.
Oh, okay. So you're saying it's ethical or it's moral to do violence, but only as a last resort. But what if, all right,
Well, I
Marcia,
have another example. The Selma marches over that bridge, which I never remember the name of. Those people got beaten up even though they were doing nothing but walking over that bridge, marching. And that wasn't appropriate either, but the government side of it wasn't appropriate because they were doing peaceful, what did he call it? Good trouble, okay? Marching peacefully as a demonstration.
okay, so therefore,
It was wrong of the government to beat those people up for no reason except for their protesting, peaceful protesting.
but what about somebody like the Nazis? Surely, if you'd been able to shoot a bunch of them in 1926, wouldn't that be ethical?
I think you had that, you answered your own question. You have to stop some of this stuff in the beginning. And then I think by the time things got physically nasty, etc., there were too many Nazis and the government couldn't control it at that point.
That's declared war. Declared war is different. No.
Okay, Minya?
I wanted to use the Boston Tea Party as an example.
Okay.
That would be civil disobedience because they were protesting over the cost of the tax on tea. But because one thing leads to another, that ended up being more than civil disobedience. Obviously, it led to a war. But I also wanted to mention that we're talking about difference in numbers of people. If you want to go back to the Torah portion, the numbers that we're aware of, I don't think are anywhere near what the population of the world has become, so that when you're dealing with civil disobedience today, I think the numbers come into play. I mean, if we want to go through different categories, you mentioned the Nazis, because it wasn't suppressed early on, it blew up into proportions that no one ever expected. Then you have the riots I call them riots, in January 6th. And what about the marching in Charlottesville? Bill? Same thing. It was supposed to be not what it turned out to be when the white supremacists marched in with their flags and yelling, the Jews aren't going to take us over, or however they put it. So we're talking about volumes of people too. So civil disobedience, as we understand it, changes depending on the time period and the number of people involved, I think.
But to take Charlottesville, what happened is still contested, and somebody here mentioned that the Capitol, what happened there is contested. So if I'm a moral person, just, trying to do civil disobedience, and I'm going to go into, I feel that there's maybe violence is required to stop the bad people. It's hard to really be able to say conclusively that there's a certain set of facts.
But I think if you're like you're saying, a person who wants to do something civilly, and other people join your group that do not want to do it civilly, the troublemakers overcome the people who want to do it civilly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Riva.
Yeah, I think I have a question. What is civil? Is civil the power, the political power, or do we defer to a higher authority? A supreme being. I think in each of these cases that we've mentioned, there have been people in power or people who had power who were harmful to society. And yet they, in some cases, were the authority and power. I think there are a couple of things. One is, do you defer to a higher power if you really believe that what's being done through the political system is morally wrong or corrupt? Then I think it makes a lot of sense to defer to that higher power. The other thing is, very often history is written by the winners. And so there's differences in who's, if you look at some of these things over time, and who writes the history, that really influences how it's portrayed.
I agree. I have a question about what you're saying. To me, the word civil has to do with society and government, not with a higher power. So when we're talking about civil disobedience, I think of it as protesting about something in our society that's in the hands of man, because they're the ones that created the societies. So I don't know if our interpretation today, unless we're going to relate it, of course, to the Torah portion, has to do with a higher power.
Cy and then Steve.
I believe that in a democratic republic, a civil disobedience is allowed. There's no question about it, because the government is a government of the people, and the people can do what they want as long as there's, as long as they're not doing damage to each other or to anything that belongs to the government. However, in a dictatorship, in as much as it's not a democratic government, the dictator is setting the rules and regulations. And you have, if you have accepted the dictatorship, you have accepted those rules and regulations. So obviously, you can't disobey, because that's not what the rules call for.
So a lot of it depends on if the government is legitimately democratically elected.
Exactly.
So if you have a dictatorship or a semi-dictatorship in Venezuela, that allows the opposition to engage in much more aggressive acts of civil disobedience. Whereas if a government is completely and totally legitimately elected, then it would not. Okay, Steve Siegel, Bernie, and Riva in that order.
Well, again, we have to look at the time frame, and when this occurred, the midwives rejected what the government wanted them to do, and to slay or to put to death all the male Jewish children or babies. And so they felt like this was wrong, and that's what they did. And I don't know what their punishment was, because it doesn't really describe it in the reading, at least that what we're showing here. But I'm sure that there was some punishment to the midwives because they didn't follow the law.
Yes, I mean, there's consequences, and governments, especially, nasty governments, want to make sure that people that engage in civil disobedience are punished. I mean, really, any government, you can't have people challenging your authority, or more people will challenge your authority, whether you're legitimate or not. Okay, Bernie and then Riva.
First, I've been having physical therapy, speech therapy for my chronic cough, so I'm not going to be talking a lot. But I have a whole different take on this. To me, the word civil disobedience means acting civilly, not just non-governmental disobedience. So that any civil disobedience, by my definition, has to be polite and non-violent.
So civil is not referring to
Not referring to
society.
civilian, right?
It's it's referring to civil behavior. Who was next? Riva and
Riva.
then Sai. Steve, you spoke already, right? Okay, so Riva and then Sai.
Yeah, I would argue that, in this country, for the most part, we've had a true democracy, but there have been periods in our country's history where the government made some terrible decisions. A few examples: locking up a whole lot of Japanese Americans, all the civil rights issues, where sometimes the government really was on the wrong side. Behavior towards the Native Americans. Again, we had a democracy, and yet populations within our country have sometimes been treated horribly.
Bernie Feinberg, Steve Siegel.
Yeah, Bernie moved, I heard.
We hear you.
All right, I moved them out. Okay, Sai.
Well, Reva, any mistakes that the government has made is because the people have endorsed those mistakes, because the government is the people. But more important than that, in the case of Egypt at the time of the Pharaoh, you got to remember the Pharaoh was a dictator. I mean, there's no questions about that. What he said goes, whether it was right or wrong. And so I don't think there's any argument about anybody trying to do something and not getting punished for it. That's the way it was.
But Sai, he's only a dictator from your point of view. From their point of view, he was the king. He was the god. So it's a different
Whatever he was,
perspective.
however, and he had all the power, which is what the important thing is, regardless of what they call him.
Okay, all right. Riva, did you speak, Riva?
I did.
Okay, then Marcia.
I'll be quick. I want to disagree with Bernie. I don't think civil is a term for the kind of behavior. I think civil really does describe disobedience to a government action or program, or whatever it is that people are referring to. They should act civilly, yes, but that's not what the word means in the term civil disobedience, I don't believe.
I don't know if Bernie was saying that that's the technical meaning. It's just that's how he interprets it. But
On the
okay.
phone right now. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't
who was
have-
next? Sai and then Minya. Sai, Minya, and Bernie.
I agree with Bernie. If you take any kind of a disagreement with what the government is doing, you can disagree, but you should not disagree violently. So therefore, the disagreement becomes civil. You do it in a civil manner. You don't go around beating up people, burning buildings, turning over trucks. That's not civil any longer. And that's the beauty of the ability to object to what the government is doing. Think of all the movements where people marched. They were against something. Those were civil disobedience, but nobody supposedly got hurt and no buildings were burnt. Once that happens, it's not civil anymore.
Okay, but that's if just because it's not civil doesn't make it necessarily wrong, right? If you've got a dictator and you can burn down a few buildings and stop the dictator, that still may be okay, right?
No, I think it's wrong once you start to destroy people and or property. Then the movement has lost its meaning.
Oh, so in Venezuela, if you could get rid of Maduro by burning down a building, you don't think that's
I'm talking
acceptable?
about in the United States.
All right, well.
Doesn't matter.
All right,
It doesn't.
I think Minya and then Bernie, is that right?
Unless Bernie wants to answer right away, because then I was going to mention something else. Bernie, do you want to go ahead of me?
Sure, I have the definition of civil disobedience. The refusal to comply with certain laws or to pay taxes and fines as a peaceful form of political protest.
Keyword being peaceful.
Right.
Word political in there it defines the word civil, being that it refers to governmental opposition,
Which is what I said.
which is what yeah.
Right,
would-
but peaceful is included in that definition.
Should be peaceful.
Okay, Minya.
I don't know exactly what the quote is, but didn't Jefferson say something about when the government doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing for you, that the people have a right to
Right.
stand up, rise and
Right on, Minya, right on.
thank you. But he being one of the founding fathers also made it clear that people should be following rules, but if they're not happy with the rules as they are, they have a right to speak up and do something.
Okay, therefore,
Therefore, civil disobedience goes with you're disobeying the rules as they were, but you want to do it in a civil way to make the world better or the society better for the people who are in it.
you agree with Cy that you can't burn down buildings?
Oh, absolutely. Just like these things in California where these mobs break down, smash windows and go steal things. That's not acceptable in a society that's a working society. I don't know what to call it, but that's disobedience. So I agree with Cy. You can't do that. That's not going to prove anything.
All right, now, in that case, the rioters are presumably trying to get fancy handbags and things. So does it have to do with profit motives? So no, civil disobedience should not involve material benefit in any way? Is that an important criteria?
I think what we're talking about is people who are breaking the rules for their own gain. It has nothing to do with the society they're living in. They're not doing it for the betterment of man. They're doing it for whatever,
Interest.
self-motivation, the word that
Interest.
means better for themselves and
So it
not
has to
making
do
things,
with,
they're not doing it for the greater good. They're doing it only for themselves.
so it has to do with motivation.
That's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Marcia.
But the problem is it's very hard to gauge people's motivation, and people might not say what their real motivation is, right? That's even in a synagogue, it's very hard. We have, there's people who behave a certain way, and I may say to them, why are they like that? And they won't tell me. They're mad at something, but they won't say what it is, or they're not mad and they will say, they'll say, I'm mad about this when they're not, it's something else. So motivation is a very tricky thing to determine.
But does their behavior affect other people?
Well, I'm just giving an example, but let's say. So motivation is a key criteria for many of you. Whether the people who are doing the civil disobedience are really trying to make the country or the city or the world a better place.
Right.
All right. Was Bernie next or no, Pam?
Well, to me, especially when you talk about the Torah portions saving the Jewish male babies, the concept to me is the greater good, the civil obedience for the greater good, ideally without violence. But basically, the question you have to ask yourself with civil obedience is what I'm doing for the greater good.
Okay. Any other comments? So we can start, we're on page 12. When is civil disobedience justified? Who'd like,
Bernie
Bernie?
has a comment.
I have a comment. Strictly biologically speaking, if I were the Pharaoh and I wanted to tamp down the growth of the Jewish people, I would kill the girl babies because you only need one male and the babies come from the females.
But the girls didn't count back then, Bernie, remember?
Just strictly biologically speaking.
One male can make many babies.
You're right.
But the
Steve,
males could be warriors and then, not defend Pharaoh. Hence the elimination of male babies in Egypt.
any other comments about male versus female babies? I mean, I think in a patriarchal society, you could see why the Pharaoh would have just naturally targeted male babies. That was where the potential power source was. Okay, who'd like to read page 12, left-hand column? Yes, Riva.
When is civil disobedience justified? The power of Pharaoh in Egypt was absolute. No one dared defy his rule or his whim. He was honored not only as the king of Egypt, but as a god. His command was the law of the land. Those who disobeyed him were subject to death. That is what makes the story of the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, so unusual. Pharaoh commands them to kill every male child born to a Jewish woman. It is an easy order to follow. After all, a new mother is weak and defenseless at the birth of her child. Yet according to the Torah, both Shiphrah and Puah refused to carry out Pharaoh's command. Why? What moved them to say no to Pharaoh, endangering their own lives by disobedience to his rule? Many commentators believe that the answer is quite clear. The midwives were Jewish. As Jews, they had no choice. No Jewish midwife could kill a Jewish baby. Jewish tradition forbids murder. This line of reasoning is followed by Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Nachmanides. They base their opinions on the earliest observation of the famous Talmudic teachers Rav and Samuel. Rav taught that Shiphrah was another name for Yocheved, Moses' mother, and that Puah was actually Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron. Samuel disagreed, holding that Puah was not Miriam, but rather Elisheva, Aaron's wife. Other rabbinic interpreters praise Shiphrah and Puah as brave Jewish heroines. These interpreters point out that the two midwives received babies that were close to death because of difficult deliveries. And when Pharaoh summoned them to his court and asked, "Why are you not obeying my orders?" they refused to answer. Instead, they defiantly offered him simple excuses. The Hebrew women are vigorous. They have their babies before we arrive to help them. Rabbi Isaac argues that Puah, who he believes was Miriam, not only defied Pharaoh, but also bravely criticized her own father, Amram. He maintains that Amram became so depressed about Pharaoh's order to kill all Jewish male babies that he stopped having sexual intercourse with his wife for fear that she would become pregnant. Then he divorced her. When other Hebrew slaves saw what he had done, they also decided to divorce their wives. According to Rabbi Isaac, Puah confronted Imram and told him that he was acting more cruelly than Pharaoh. The king ordered the death of all Jewish male children, but you are preventing the conception of birth of all children. Furthermore, because you are a leader, others are following you. Hearing her criticism, Amram immediately remarried his wife, and the other Israelite men followed his example.
Okay, thank you, Riva. All right, so we have and welcome to Diane and Bill. Welcome. You can keep muted there, and then when you want to speak, you unmute, and then you mute again when you want to unspeak. Okay, so we have here quite a lot of material, but it all circles around these two women, Shiphrah and Puah. One of the interpretations that is of Rav. So we have here some of the most famous rabbinic interpreters, just so you're aware. Rav and Shmuel are one of the pairs in the Talmud who argue back and forth. And Rav says that Shifra is really not Shifra, but Shifra was really Yocheved. And who is Yocheved?
Moses' mother.
Correct. Pua was actually Miriam. And who's Miriam?
Aaron and
Aaron.
sister.
Moses' sister.
Correct.
Sister, yes.
So why, I mean, this is obviously, ridiculous, because if Shifra and Pua was Yocheved and Miriam, then presumably the Bible would have called them Yocheved and Miriam. Why would Rav make this, this comment or try to explain that these people were other people? Marcia.
I guess he wanted to make heroines of them. And in this particular situation, to me,
So,
that's,
but they are heroines, but
but
why
he's
can't?
adding on to the heroine.
So why
Embellish.
can't Shifra and Pua be heroines? Why do
don't
they
know
have
why-
to be
why
someone
he went
else?
for that, but I think that's what the reason is.
Okay, Pam and then Cy.
Maybe they're not sure who they are and they're guessing.
Uh-huh. But they have names that we are sure who they are.
But we don't know if they're Jewish.
What do we care?
That has to do with their morals and how they're gonna act based on their belief in God.
Well, good people are good people, right? What does it matter? I mean, it's civil disobedience anyway. I mean, there's really no one, even the family of Pharaoh, that could get away with disobeying a direct order from Pharaoh, right? They should be executed on the spot or worse, I would think. Okay, Riva, D, anyone? Okay, Steve.
Well, maybe they use different names as midwives rather than their real names.
Oh, so it's like stage names or professional names,
Exactly.
like a woman gets married, but as a dentist, she uses her maiden name, and then in private life, she uses her married name. So nobody bothers her when she's having lunch at Champy's with their toothache. Cy.
This is an aside. The Pharaoh, in my mind, was not too bright. Here he goes ahead, wants to kill all the Jewish men who were providing cheap labor, for him. Wasn't costing him any money. They were building all kinds of huge buildings, and things were pretty good. Why would he decide he want to kill all the Jewish people, the Jewish men?
Well, he's killing
don't
babies who won't be
understand.
able to do any labor for 10 or 15 years at least. So he's he's not really obviously thinking long-term, he's thinking short-term.
Yeah,
And I
not
hate
good.
I hate to draw the comparison, but the Nazis did the same thing, right? They had all this Jewish labor and they killed them, right? Like, why would you do that? It's completely against your own economic and political interests. So
That's why slavery in the South for the Southerners was good. They were breeding them there.
and the Southerners were interested in economic gain.
That's right. They were breeding slaves.
And once the international slave trade was prohibited, they had no choice. That they couldn't buy or import any more slaves. They had to make their own, essentially.
Right.
So that's but this seems to be much more personal and much more it's eliminationist. They want to kill the Hebrews, it's not really about slavery, is it? In an economic sense. Okay, so then what's the story here of Amram? So Amram is the father. If you believe that Pua is Miriam, Moses' sister, then you believe that her own father, Amram, his response to this is completely and totally inappropriate. What does Amram do, in response to Pharaoh's decree?
Abstinence
Minya or Pam? Pam?
I said abstinence
And divorce.
and divorce.
Okay.
Good point.
What's so terrible
And-
about
And
abstinence?
remarried.
What's so terrible about abstinence?
I said abstinence, and Minion mentioned also remarriage.
Well, divorce
So what's
first.
so terrible about
Divorce. Divorce.
what's
and
so
then
terrible
remarriage.
about what he did?
Well, we're going to be less Jewish babies in general born because of his actions and people following his actions.
So he's giving up. He's
Right.
saying if they're gonna kill the babies anyway,
Yeah.
let's not have them.
Yeah.
And, Judaism's a optimistic religion. So, you have to hope and pray and expect that things will work out. You can't just give up. And so that I guess is the sin of pessimism and the giving into sense of futility. Bernie, and then if Diane or Bill want to say something, you can.
Is there any halacha around birth control?
Well, sure, it's complicated, but in traditional Judaism with halakha, there's certain types of birth control that are more acceptable than others, depending on certain concepts. Different rabbis would have different views, different Orthodox rabbis would have different views, but in general, I'd say that Orthodox rabbis would allow certain types of birth control, but others less so.
I ask that because I could see where these passages could lead to some halacha around birth control.
Now this is from the Exodus Rabbah, which is a midrash. So this whole story is coming from, the Talmudic era from around 400, 500 CE. And clearly the rabbis at that time already believed that the more children, the better. And that's not a very modern approach, but that's how they felt. And that's how the ultra-Orthodox today still feel. Diane or Bill, you want to say something? You just unmute and you can comment. You can be as uncensored as you like, but remember we're being recorded, so whatever you say will be there forever.
Well, coming in late on this, we did try to get in, couldn't get in. There was no such thing as divorce in those days. I mean, you dumped the wife or they dumped, it just didn't make any sense. The whole concept of divorce was not even an issue then, was it? I've never heard of that.
The Midrash is from the Talmudic period, and in the Talmudic time period of 200, 400 CE, there definitely was divorce. The Talmud has an entire tractate devoted to Gittin. How do you write a divorce document? And the whole ketubah, which was developed, around the same time, is designed to protect the wife in the event of divorce. So the ketubah is a prenuptial agreement, really, and it specifies that in the event of divorce, if the husband wants to get rid of her, he can do so, but he has to pay her a certain amount of money, basically alimony or compensation or whatever. And then when he divorces her, he has to present her with a get. She has to accept the get, and then there's a certain financial payout that she gets, which
I knew
presumably
in modern times.
So now this is in the Talmudic period that the rabbis here are talking about the biblical period. So that's so it gets kind of complicated because the rabbis are writing about a period that is like at least 1500 years earlier. So we have to differentiate between the Egyptian time period, which is described in the Bible, from the time when the Bible was written, which was several hundred years later, and the time that the rabbis are commenting on the Bible, which is several hundred years after that. So we're talking about 3 time periods that span like 2,000 years. So obviously attitudes changed. Now, what was the attitude to marriage and divorce in the time of the Exodus, the 13th century BCE, or more than 3,000 years ago? That's a really hard one to comment upon. So it's sort of a question that Sai asks a lot about the historical circumstances of the Bible itself. But you don't really see too much in the Bible that would be, that we, would make it clear exactly what might have happened in that time. But we can talk about this more at a future date, but that gives you just a little bit. Sai, do you want to add anything
Thank
to
you.
that?
I was curious as to what happens to the midwives in disobeying the Pharaoh's order. Does he do anything to them?
Well, anybody want to answer that? Do they get executed? If it was me and I was the Pharaoh, I would just say off with their heads now.
Gentlemen, Sai, please
I
leave
don't,
your name and number. We will call you back as soon as possible.
I don't know who that is, Rabbi, but somebody's on the phone.
yeah, sorry. Okay. So if I was the Pharaoh, I would just have their heads cut off right there and then. I don't need to know any more details. They're accused of not following my orders. They come in front of me, they seem evasive. What kind of excuses do they give? That the Hebrew women are strong. They just have their babies without our help, and we're by the time we get there, they're already done with having their babies, and we have no ability to kill the babies. What kind of nonsense is that? Could I possibly believe that? Off with their heads. And even if they're right, I don't care. I'm the Pharaoh, I'm the king, I'm the God. If things aren't going my way, I'll execute them and start over with new midwives, and maybe it'll go better with a new group. Marcia.
Well, I'm skipping ahead, and there's controversy as to whether these midwives were Jewish or whether they were Egyptian. And as we read on, it talks about them being Jewish, not Egyptian, because the Egyptian king would give his order to Egyptians whom he thought he could trust to carry them out. So I don't know who do you believe?
What does it matter, Marcia? That's what I asked that question earlier.
It
What
would
does it
matter if he would put the Jewish women to death, midwives to death a lot more easily, I would think, than he would the Egyptian ones. Do you think?
Why?
Because he didn't like them.
Yeah, but he's dictator over his own people. If he's too soft on his own people, they'll rebel against him quicker than the Israelites. I mean, if I was the Pharaoh of Egypt, I'm first and foremost worried about the Egyptians. And if I show any sign of softness, my own people are gonna betray me, right?
Right.
Most rulers are betrayed by their own, not by the outside. So I don't care if they're Egyptian or Israelites, but obviously the commentators do. Marcia's correct. And so whether they're Israelites or Egyptians makes a big difference, apparently. But either way, they apparently they're heroes of this story, very much heroes. Okay, yes, Dee.
Maybe he didn't kill them because he had a fear of God.
And that's true either way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any other reason, even if they were Egyptian. But it also, as Marcia said, it goes on to say that they converted to Judaism, those two heroic women, by not killing the babies and lying to the Pharaoh. This is where civil disobedience actually comes in, because they didn't do what they were told. They stood on ground to their moral belief, and they lied to the Pharaoh and told the Pharaoh that the babies were already born. So I think that's where civil disobedience comes in. And the only thing I can think of is that Pharaoh was feared the God of Israel. I can't see any other reason.
Okay. And so these two women behaved in a highly ethical fashion, but wouldn't it be natural? I mean, you're a midwife and you're suddenly told that you have to murder the babies. I mean, what midwife is going to be able to do that? That you've devoted your whole life to helping babies. You can't just go and, I mean, a normal person's not going to kill babies, right? I mean, you become a murderous psychopath or something. I mean, to murder babies, multiple babies, you'd have to be, like it's almost beyond comprehension. It's different than, okay, cheating on your income tax or speeding or stealing a candy bar from CVS. Maybe I could do all those things, but I'm not going out and killing babies, no matter how bad a person I am. It's just not, it's not something you could do. D.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the Holocaust, and
Right.
there was no problem with any of the Nazis killing babies and taking heads off other babies and putting them on other babies. So I don't know. I mean,
Well, these were self-selected people, that worked in the concentration camps or were part of the Eisengruppen, and although there's a book by Christopher Browning about a normal German Weimar group from just the regular army. They were not SS soldiers who were assigned to shoot Jews in the Ukraine. And, there's a lot of interesting psychological things that you can, what if when ordinary people are placed in such a situation? And but many of the Nazis, most of the Nazis that involved in killing Jews were people who were not normal people to begin with, but some were, and it was interesting what would happen when a person who is not volunteering for anything like that is suddenly thrust into a position where they're ordered to do that. Yes, Riva.
You have to unmute.
We can't hear you. Yeah.
Eva, you have to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. I think in societies where babies are born with the assistance of midwives, that midwives in the society are highly respected people. And so often they're really people who really devote their lives to delivering babies and taking care of mothers. And I think in whatever culture they might be from, whether they're Egyptian or Jewish at the time of the period of this story, that midwives would tend to be people who want to preserve life. And
Correct. And it's almost the same when they wanted doctors to administer the capital punishment, the drugs in a prison. And so you could be a doctor who's in favor of capital punishment, but you would still not see it as appropriate for you to participate in an execution because, your job
No
is to
harm.
save lives, not to execute people. Maybe if you favored capital punishment, you might say, well, somebody else should do it, but not a doctor. But then the prison says, well, we need a doctor to make sure it's done right, and so forth. And so, okay. Other comments, or we'll go on. So we're on the top of page 13. Oh, but let's read the bottom of 12 in the little box. This is an interesting comment, and this again comes from Midrash Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah, one of the main Midrashic collections, which is dated to roughly 500 CE, or about 1500 years ago, right in the middle of the rabbinic period. Anyone like to volunteer to read bottom right-hand corner of page 12. Okay, Minya?
What the midwives did. The rabbis, whose comments are included in the Midrash, praise the midwives for many acts of kindness during the oppression of Pharaoh. First, they took food and drink from the rich and brought it to the houses of the poor and the hungry. They prayed that each child would be born in good health and not crippled in any way. They prayed that no child or mother would die at childbirth. They made Abraham's hospitality a model for themselves by opening their homes to all who required food and shelter.
All right, what do you think? Is there any modeling there that we can adopt, Pam?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think if we reach out to people like that with and have higher standards, that everybody has a successful childbirth, then yes, I mean, that's a good goal to have.
So of the 4 elements here, do you agree with all 4?
Yes.
Okay. So taking food and drink from the rich. It doesn't say in this summary whether that was like a voluntary thing or not. Praying that each child be born in good health. Number 3, prayed that no child would die at childbirth. And number 4, that hospitality, opening their own homes to all who might need help.
See, I took number 1 as not stealing the food from the rich, but asking the rich to provide it.
Yes.
Donations, yeah.
So if that's the way it actually was, that would be great. And so, but it, obviously it has to be voluntary. But then, what do you do when the rich won't give? And that becomes a problem. We mentioned Venezuela a little while ago, but a lot of these countries get into this because the elite rich are perceived by the masses of poor as not being very sympathetic to them. So eventually, when there's a populist contender who says, I'm going to help you guys, and you have been completely ignored or rejected by the elite of the country, then they vote, they vote or they support such a person. And that usually ends up just impoverishing poor and rich. But, the cycle starts because the elite of a country are not perceived as being sufficiently caring about those less fortunate. So it's in the rich's interest, in fact, to help the poor. Okay, page 13, we're back to Shifra and Pua and the issue of whether they were Israelite and or Egyptian. We're trying to draw existential lessons from this. We're not that interested in the actual determination of their ethnic background. Doesn't seem to me to make much interest, but what else can we learn from this? Minya, you want to keep reading page 13?
Rabbi Akiba agrees with those who argue that Shifra and Pua were brave Jewish women. He even goes so far as to state that God liberated the Jewish people from Egypt because of the heroic and righteous deeds of the women. Akiba justifies his observation by pointing out that when they saw their husbands suffering as slaves, overworked, starved, and beaten, they did not think selfishly of themselves, but they went out to comfort them in the fields. They took them food, they brought them water and bathed them. They even insisted on having sexual intercourse, telling their husbands that they had to preserve the Jewish people. I have a problem with that one line, but we'll go back, I guess. They did not allow they did not allow their husbands to become physically weak or to lose faith in the future. For all their disobedience to Pharaoh's orders, Akiba says these women were credited with the liberation from Egypt. Not all interpreters, however, agree that Shifra and Pua were Jewish, nor is there any proof within the Torah text that the midwives were Yoheved, Miriam, or Elshiva. The meaning,
Elisheva,
Elsheva. The meaning of the
Elisheva.
Hebrew of the Torah is unclear. While, I'll let you say the Hebrew,
Miyaldot ha'ivriot.
could mean Hebrew midwives. It could also mean midwives of the Hebrews and be understood as Egyptian midwives of the Hebrews.
Okay, right. So Miyaldot means those who help others give birth. Ha'ivriot could mean that they themselves, meaning the midwives, were Hebrews, or it could mean that their job was the people who help Hebrew women give birth. And it, to me, again, it doesn't matter, because the point is that these were midwives working primarily with the Hebrews. What their own ethnic identity, it doesn't seem to matter. Okay, Cy, and then maybe Bill.
I'm a little confused as to at what point in time were they able to recognize themselves? I'm talking about the Jewish people, the Hebrews, recognize themselves as different, as Hebrews or as Jews. You know, where did this come from? There were just a lot of people there, but all of a sudden they now have a religion, and they're all together and they're all friends,
Right.
buddies.
Well,
and
it's a classic thing. I just was working this morning on my chauffeur column for the monthly newsletter, and I'm trying to define what is important about, being active in the temple. I mean, people are active in the temple because they have friends and because they like the onegs and because it's entertaining. But what is the real religious meaning of this? And so I mentioned just in passing that, when we had the harm done to the menorah in the Holocaust Memorial, which may have been an anti-Semitic thing, or it may have been an attempt to steal the medal, but either way, it was perceived as an attack against the Jewish people. Then everybody unites. Anti-Semitism brings us all together. And so here you have a classic case of this, where the Hebrews are enslaved. We're enslaved. Everybody is united. We're in crisis. And now they want to kill our male sons, so, it's tragic, but it's much easier to unify people when they're under external attack. Bill, did you want to make a comment, or if not, anyone else? Yes, Riva.
Yeah, I
Riva,
think
Marcia.
Yeah, I think you're making a very interesting point. Many of our parents, myself included, many of us who had parents, my parents often talked about anti-Semitism. And I, at a later generation, was more assimilated than my parents. I didn't experience that kind of anti-Semitism. And I think it was during that transitional period, perhaps in the 60s and 70s, that many of us felt like belief in anti-Semitism held the Jews together. But if anti-Semitism is disappearing, or you think it's disappearing, then there's less reason to stay cohesive as a people.
Right, and that's the point we've achieved today in America. We're not, fearful of anti-Semitism to a major degree. And so of the 16,000 Jews in the West Valley, only a tiny percentage come together because there's no need to come together. And so therefore you only come together if you find something religiously meaningful or spiritually important, or you're just habituated that way by your parents, or whatever the reason is, but you have to have a good reason. But you send a few neo-Nazis running around, and suddenly everyone will be in front of the temple, praying, and so, Marcia.
That's exactly am I mute? No. That's exactly what happened after 9/11. I remember I was living in California, and so that was a Tuesday, maybe, I think. And they had it was either Wednesday or Thursday, the congregation had a service. It might have been like a Thursday morning service. It was like high holidays. They had police having to do the traffic management in the parking lot. It was so many people showed up because of the United States being attacked. And people felt good about being together and praying together. And it was, really quite something to see. And if any of us who lived through, in most of our cases, in my, case, it was the beginnings of World War II, not the very beginnings, but when the United States got involved, Simon was there a little longer than me. And we know how the United States united at that point as a country because we were at war. So it makes a big difference in the extreme circumstances that you worry about politicians putting us in harm's way for their own purposes to make us feel to get behind them. I mean, this is a typical political ploy that people have. So, I lost you guys here. Yeah, that's about what I wanted to say.
Minya.
Just to go back to Marcia's comment, don't you think that people coming together like that, and the two examples that she gave, came together as Americans and not so much as Jewish people?
In which two examples?
9/11, and when she said about World War II, which was before my time. But it was
Sort of
because
both.
people were showing their American patriotic side, not so much that it was Jews coming together in the synagogue. The synagogue was almost, I think, like a community center, so that people could come there and show their patriotic support, which is how I would interpret what you
It was
just
a
said.
way for people to get together as a group.
Right.
Agreed. Sai.
Well, Marcia explains the situation on the basis of we knowing who we are ahead of time. I'm talking about the story in the Bible where these people, from what I read, don't know who they are. I mean, who are they? There are a lot of people, but what's their common bond? What did they believe in? Who were their forefathers? That's what I'm getting at. We here in America have a history. We now, as even as Jews, we have a history. We have a history as Americans. But what kind of history did those people have at that time?
And I guess that's the question the Book of Exodus wants to answer. Pam.
That's the question.
Yeah, follow up on Sai. So Sai, don't they have the history of Jacob and Joseph that they can, go back to?
I don't know, Pam. That's the question I'm asking.
But if they did, that's a very partial history. So they know that their ancestor came down to Egypt and was a big shot and helped the country survive a famine. And that later a new Pharaoh came about and enslaved them. But that's not a belief system. That's just a little bit of background, a family background and political background. Once they leave Egypt, then they get the 10 Commandments, they get the Torah, there's a sense of a covenant. This is the point I'm trying to make in this month's shofar, in next month's shofar, that we don't just come to make personal relationships with people that we like. There's a certain basis of that it's in the context of the covenantal community. Our friends that we make at synagogue are in some ways slightly different than friends we meet in the dog park. And the reason is because we're all presumably part of this covenantal community. Okay, Cy, and then if Pam wants to.
I'd like to add that within the framework of the slaves that the Pharaoh had, I'm sure there were other groups other than Hebrews, if you will, that were slaves. Now, whether they were incorporated into the Exodus later on, I don't know, but there had to be other peoples, assuming the story is correct.
Okay, agreed. Pam, you can continue reading on page 13.
Well, before that, I was hoping Minya would come back to her her hesitation about the part of Rabbi Akiba.
Oh, I could go back to that. I don't understand why. Here you have these men who are starving. They've been beaten and they're walking around with guards ready to whip them at any moment. And these women come along and say, stop, we have to have sexual intercourse. I don't think that makes any sense in reality.
Oh, come on, Minya. Yeah, you know, if you want to sell a story, you got to stick in some sex somewhere.
You're right. You're right. That's what it was.
I mean, you know, if you take the sex out, they would never make a movie about it. But it's a good question. You know, it's these comments are not necessarily supposed to present the most realistic option. You know, there's a certain ideological reason for these comments. Riva?
Yeah, I lived in India for a while, and in an area where there was a real mix of Hindus and Muslims, and they were always competing to have the most babies. And part of that was about, we want to be the dominant culture, we want to be the dominant religion, we want to be the dominant whatever. And I'm wondering if this is part of what's underlying some of what we're reading, and that is the Pharaoh wants to keep the population of Jews down so that they don't become more powerful. And the Jews want to have more babies because they do want to have more power. And we see that even to current days where the ultra-Orthodox Jews make babies at an incredible rate. For whatever reason they choose, because they say God said, be fruitful and multiply. But I think underlying that is, you know, grow and be a more powerful presence.
Okay.
It's not very
so would you
sexy, sorry.
think the situation in India and in Egypt at this time have parallels?
Yeah, in that I think in underlying some of the rationale for having more babies or controlling the number of babies is based on this other kind of incentive.
Okay. Pam, would you like to read a little more?
Well, Minya was doing such a good job.
Okay. We'll turn it back to Minya.
I would say, I don't mind sharing the floor, Pam, if you want to go ahead. You're deferring to me. Both the commentator philosopher Philo, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and the historian general Flavius Josephus, maintain that Shiphrah and Puah were Egyptian. Others agree. Both Don Isaac Abravanel and Samuel Shemuel David Luzzatto, known as Shadal, argue that midwives must have been Egyptian. How, they ask, would Pharaoh order Jewish women to put to death children of their own people and not expect that they would make such a plan public? It is only logical, they conclude, to assume that the Egyptian king gave his orders to Egyptians whom he thought he could trust to carry them out. If Shiphrah and Puah were Jewish or converts to Judaism, then their defiance of Pharaoh's order was a heroic act against the oppression of their people. By demanding that they murder every Jewish male newborn, Pharaoh had declared war on the Jewish people. Once Pharaoh began to oppress them, their loyalty was to their people and to God, not to the ruler or to the laws of Egypt. As Jews, they were victims. Their disobedience of Pharaoh's orders were justified by their obedience to the law of God and to the survival of their people. But if Shiphrah and Puah were Egyptian, what justification might they offer for their civil disobedience to Pharaoh? Modern biblical scholar Nahum M. Sarna observes that the Torah provides us with an explanation of their motivation. We are told that Shiphrah and Puah refused to follow Pharaoh's order out of fear of God. They believed in the sanctity of human life. For them, each human being was sacred and filled with possibilities for creativity and good. They acted out of a conviction that there is a higher power than Pharaoh, who makes moral demands on human beings for the preservation of life. Their belief, Sarna explains, led them to reject the Egyptian ruler's command to murder the newborn babies of the Hebrews. Here we have history's first recorded case of civil disobedience in defense of a moral cause.
Okay. Comments on Sarna?
I think that last paragraph sums up everything we've been discussing.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I think for me, it's a very good explanation as to why they did what they did without fear of consequences. And again, we don't know what the consequences were, but definitely by doing what they thought was right because of a higher power, somebody greater than Pharaoh or something greater than Pharaoh, they were able to perform civil disobedience in what they felt was an act of morality.
Okay, Pam or Cy or D? Steve? Okay, D.
Well, I agree with Mina. I said it before. I saw that as I read this before our class as really an analogy of civil disobedience at its best, because they rose to the occasion and they had a fear of some supreme being, and they looked at both sides of it, and they made a moral judgment by not killing the babies and lying to Pharaoh.
Okay. Let's look at the little box at the bottom of 13 and top of 14. And this is from Bayard Rustin. Minya?
Questions for civil disobedience. Civil rights leader Bayard Rustin once suggested these questions as a guide for civil disobedience. 1, have I exhausted the available constitutional methods of bringing about the desired change? 2, do the people I urge to join me sincerely seek to improve the society, or do they wish to excite passions that would destroy society itself? 3, what is likely to be the effect of the resistance on me, on others, and on the community? 4, what are my own motives and objectives? Clear to myself and to others, is my aim genuine social change or mere self-gratification? 5, given that I oppose specific laws, am I prepared out of my deep respect for law itself to suffer the consequences of my disobedience? Civil
What do you think of this? What do you think of this list?
I think they're good questions, and they go back to what we've been saying about whether motivation is to improve society or is it for self-gratification. And the only thing is, I don't think that people who are in a position to act out of society are going to question these motives or ask themselves these questions. They just do it out of self.
Cy? Cy, any response?
I have nothing.
No? Marcia?
I think they were very good questions. I was reading ahead and I read those. I think I don't think most people who are apt to do the self-reflection that these questions require. I think a lot of people act on impulse and not think it out of the way these questions line it up, you know?
But I think many of the radical leaders today on both sides would not accept these questions. Like they would feel that they're too moderate and that it's okay to, to reject the available constitutional methods, that they don't feel you have to exhaust them. They would reject the whole concept itself and say, let's just pull it all down.
Excuse me. But
Okay.
But I mean, wouldn't you, especially number 4, I mean, my own motives and objectives have to be clear to myself. And a lot of people just act on, as I said, on impulse. I don't think they do think it out. I think you're right, though.
Okay. Minya, the second one, this is Pinchas Pelly, who was a rabbi in Florida.
Civil disobedience and liberation. We may understand how Hebrew women would muster the courage to disobey the king's orders and refuse to kill Hebrew children. But consider the significance of their deed. If Shiphrah and Puah were valiant Egyptian women who rebuffed the great Pharaoh, they did not say, my country right or wrong. The cause of the Hebrew midwives is proof that dissenting individuals can resist evil and thus start a whole process of liberation.
Well, what do you think? I guess it depends on the dictator. If he executes enough people quickly enough, he can end any hope for national liberation. If he hesitates, so actually the more ruthless the dictator, the harder he'll be to overcome. But maybe I'm being cynical here. Any comment?
I agree, because I was going to say, if there depends on what the consequences would be to these individuals that are dissenting. Like you said, are they going to be executed immediately, or do they get away with it? And then they form a stronger coalition behind them. So it really depends, I think, on who's leading the country or the society, that society at the time.
When Fidel Castro tried to overthrow Batista in the early 1950s, the attack against a fort in the eastern part of the country it failed miserably. Many of his people were killed, and Castro and the survivors were put into a prison on an island. If Batista had executed them all, there would never have been a communist revolution in Cuba. But Batista not only didn't execute them, but he let them study and almost train in their prison, on their island prison, and then released them very soon after. So, I guess, if you're going to be a dictator, you've got to go all the way, and you've got to resolve, I'm going to kill everybody who even looks at me the wrong way. And it's not a very pleasant way to live, but if you are too nice and you're a dictator, that's not good for you.
What about Hitler being in prison and having a chance to write Mein Kampf?
Okay, same
If he was
exact
eliminated,
parallel,
right, we wouldn't have even had that to deal with.
Right, but yet as Democrats, Democrats in the sense of in favor of democracy, we're not in favor of just executing people that we think might be a threat in the future. If they've committed relatively minor crimes, we can't just go out and shoot them.
Right.
We might put them in prison for a year or two, and that's not necessarily the best policy to prevent things, but we have to follow, values, and we have to be consistent in those values. Otherwise, I mean, how do we determine who's a mortal threat to our lives and our democratic institutions? We could end up killing people who are really harmless eccentrics, that people just go out and say weird things. but they pose really no threat to us. We don't know. Cy,
Well, I don't know if anybody's ever read the Pentagon Papers, but that was the big problem in Vietnam. We went to war against people who were not bothering us and who we had nothing against. And we had all this civil disobedience at that time in this country. I don't know if you remember any of it, where
Yeah.
people did not want to go to war and so forth. And there was so much of this kind of stuff. The country was absolute turmoil. And that was the proper civil disobedience. And Johnson, realized that and never ran again.
Riva,
I was just thinking another example of that is during the early years of AIDS, there was a lot of civil disobedience, a lot of it aimed at our US government and against the biomedical research community, where particularly gay members of society were pushing very, very hard to pay that more money would pay for biomedical research. And I remember going to a conference where there was a lot of criticism of NIH at the time. And we had all these policemen on horses, surrounding us so that we could safely get from our hotels to the conference building. And ultimately, that group, Civil Disobedience, really paid off because the government changed. And finally, money was spent to do the research that was absolutely needed.
final comments, one or two final comments, and then we'll do the final blessing. Marcia,
So it doesn't really matter whether these two ladies were Jewish or Egyptian. It was their moral standards that were their heroism. So I think that's what we have to take from that.
that is it. Are you speaking for yourself or you're summarizing what you think everybody feels?
I think everybody feels that do you feel that? I think it's just pretty obvious, it doesn't matter what their political background or what their nationality, what do you want to call themselves, they were heroines no matter.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I agree with Marcia as well.
Okay.
Okay, back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Rabbi, and everyone's contributions today. I thought it was quite interesting. Let us conclude with the final blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natalanu Torah emet v'chayei olam notaf Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Torah. Blessed is Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who has given us a teaching of truth, implanted within us eternal life. Blessed is Adonai, giver of the Torah. Amen. Riva, do you have any comments about possible the luncheon or?
The luncheon is on. In the last Torah mailing I sent out to everybody, I mentioned that we're going to be meeting. The consensus was that it's on January 5th at 1:30 at and Angela's restaurant. I'll send you more information about this when I send out the next Torah readings this Friday.
Okay.
I've heard from some people, but not everybody, who wants to attend. I think we're going to have a very good attendance. A lot of people said they were interested in going and that date they were available. So please confirm to me that if you've said you wanted to go, please, and I'll remind you when I send out the reading on Friday. Pam's hand is up. Were you going to ask something, Pam?
Nope.
These are just people who raised their hands because you want to go.
I think we're all ready to have lunch.
Fantastic. I'm thrilled that there's so many people who are interested in going and that we got so much collaboration. Even some people changed their schedules to open up that January 5th so that they could join us for lunch. Thank you.
And I'm a yes also.
Fantastic, Minya.
Marcia.
Marcia. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye,
Bernie,
everybody.
we'll see you.
Have a good holiday.
Yes,
Everyone else too, yes.
Thank you. Stay well.
stay healthy.
Yep.
Another enjoyable class.